First of all, I just want to mention that Wisconsin won last night. I won't tell you who they played, but my condolences to any Iowa fans out there.
God exalts the humble.
Thank you. I have no response to that. In the world today, especially among perhaps some younger people, I know people of my generation, there's this idea that exists that it's popular to disassociate oneself from organized religion. I have some friends who tell me that they don't believe in organized religion, institutionalized religion. They want to separate themselves from that. Or there's those, I also have friends who talk about being spiritual but not religious. Again, that they're open to spiritual things but don't identify with or want to be connected with a particular organized religion. And if you've been following the news at all lately, it may be tempting for ourselves to think that we don't want to be associated with an organized religion, maybe this one in particular. Whatever, as there's news about corruption, scandal, finance, and otherwise that exists. But the thing is, throughout the whole history of the church, from the beginning of Christianity, there have been people in every age who have been corrupt, who have tried to use their positions of authority in the church for their own gain or wealth or honor or power in the world. And really, if you really step back and think about it, this is probably the less surprising thing. Because if you're observant of the world and humanity at all, you come to realize pretty quickly there's a lot of brokenness and fallenness that exists in humanity in the world. That we live in a sinful and broken and fallen world. And that the church is made up of such people. Really, the more miraculous thing is that this whole church thing even endured at all is really the miraculous thing. Because there's so many times this church, really, that there were corrupt people at times leading the church. There's so many times this church just should have failed. Should have been dead in the water. And yet somehow, miraculously, it kept going. One of my favorite stories, I think I've shared this one before, but I'll share it again. When Napoleon Bonaparte was going about conquering all of Europe, expanding his empire, he met one delegate of the church, some important cardinal or such, and he told him, Napoleon Bonaparte said, "I'm going to destroy the church." And the church delegate simply sighed and said, "Sir, we clergy have been trying to destroy the church from within for 1,700 years. What makes you think you're going to do any better?" And even more so, the miraculous thing that this church even endured and continued at all, but even more so that good has been done through it. And in fact, some quite heroic and miraculous amounts of good. You see, it's like Jesus knew what he was doing when he established this institution that we call the church. He established this institution that would stand against the forces of evil and darkness and death that exists in the world. This institution to be the message of light and hope and goodness and life. And to establish this institution that's not merely dependent on the whims of sinful and broken people. That doesn't simply change with the whims of the time. What is moral and true is whatever is most popular at the time. But he instituted this church. Created this institution so that throughout the ages, that the gospel would continue to be proclaimed, that what is good and true and virtuous and right and just and beautiful would continue to be taught, that people would be nourished with the body and blood of Jesus Christ, that sins would be obliterated, that people would experience healing and blessing, that he would channel this institution through which he channels his grace and power and life and mercy and blessing and healing into the world. And that the poor would be served, and people would hear the message of hope and salvation. And all this, many times, in and through broken people. And even more often, in spite of them. That even if people fail to live what they taught, that it would still be taught. That his grace and mercy would be channeled into the world. And it's this faith that's been passed on, that people have heroically been inspired by this faith to rise to and face death and darkness and destruction and despair that exists in the world. But it's this institution that's fueled tremendous faith. The martyrs who stake their life on this faith. We hear about in our first reading today from 2 Maccabees, the early Jewish martyrs. Later we have many Christian martyrs in our faith who gave their lives, who staked their life on this institution, this belief of what Christ has handed on. And this statement of faith in the Creed, I had a professor in seminary who would often remind us, don't take the words of that creed lightly, because there is blood on that creed. In other words, people staked their life on that statement of faith and gave their lives for this. And that this faith that has been passed on and this grace and power of Christ has been channeled into the world, this institution has raised up, has inspired men and women to live lives of heroic sanctity. And not simply to shy away from the dark things of the world, but run to those places of death and darkness and despair, bearing the banner of Christ. I think of saints like the many saints who lived during the Great Plague in Europe, when death seemed rampant, and when many plague victims were left behind, that they would go and love and care them, even though they knew the plague victim would still likely die. But that they wanted that person to know that they were loved and cared for and not abandoned. And to pray with them and give them words of encouragement, even though they knew that they themselves would likely contract the sickness and die themselves. And yet did not shy away. I think of saints like Saint Damien of Molokai, who banished himself to the leper colony on the island of Molokai. That he knew that once he stepped foot on that island of that leper colony, he would never be allowed to leave that island again. And he would be banished from the rest of the world. And yet he went to be with those people, to live with them in their banishment and exile, to bring healing and hope and life of Christ, to love and care for them. I think of people like St. Vincent de Paul, who himself was began to be one of those corrupt and worldly priests. That's how he started off his ministry, more concerned about gaining wealth and power for himself. But then became converted by this gospel message of Christ, by his encounter with the poor. And turned his life around then to live and bring the message of hope to the poor. To remind priests of the beauty of their calling. And of course, people like St. Mother Teresa of Calcutta and many, many others who gave their lives to serving the poorest of the poor. Who did not shy away but went to the heart of those places of disease and darkness. See, brothers and sisters, you are a part of this institution. You are a part of that community. Because there are some days when I think about my life and look at the world, and sometimes I wonder, is my life really making any sort of impact, difference in the world? Especially when you turn on the TV and read the news and all the dark and dismal things going on in the world. Sometimes I wonder, is what am I doing any good or making any difference? But then the great hope is to remember that I am a part of this institution established by Christ to stand against the forces of evil and darkness and death in the world, to stand against injustice, and to bring the message of light and hope and truth and goodness and beauty. We are a part of something, a mission so much greater than ourselves. And to me, that is something of great hope. That our lives are at the service of this profound mission, which you and I are a part. To be the force of light in the world, to go forth and bear that light of Christ to the places of darkness and death and despair. Amen.